The cruelest mistake is not losing someone you love, but realizing their worth only after they have chosen to walk away. The massive gates of Silvermoon Palace stood open beneath a pale autumn sky as a cold breeze carried fallen leaves across the marble courtyard, yet no one dared to move. Hundreds of nobles dressed in silver and black stood in perfect silence. Royal guards held their positions without shifting a single step, and servants who had worked inside the palace for decades quietly lowered their heads, unable to watch what was about to happen. In the center of that endless silence, Claire Bennett walked alone. The young Omega wore a simple ivory cloak over a modest blue dress, and everything she owned rested inside one worn leather satchel, hanging gently from her shoulder. There were no royal jewels, no expensive luggage, and no loyal procession following behind her. 3 years inside the greatest palace in the Northern Kingdom had been reduced to a single bag and a road leading away from the only place she had ever believed could become home. High above the courtyard, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stood motionless on the grand stone balcony overlooking the palace entrance. His dark ceremonial coat moved softly in the wind, but he remained completely still, watching every step Claire took across the polished marble below. The members of the royal council believed they had protected the kingdom by convincing their king to exile a dangerous outsider. They whispered among themselves with quiet satisfaction, certain that order had finally been restored. None of them noticed that Ethan never joined their celebration. His silver eyes never left the woman walking farther away with every heartbeat. He told himself this decision had been necessary. A ruler could not ignore accusations that threatened the safety of his kingdom. A king had responsibilities greater than personal feelings. Those were the words he had repeated to himself throughout the long, sleepless night before sunrise. Yet somehow they sounded weaker now than they had inside the council chamber only hours earlier. Claire did not slow her pace. She did not search the balconies for one last glimpse of the man she had trusted. She did not pause beside the gardens she had spent countless mornings helping the elderly gardener restore after harsh winters. She passed the palace library where she had organized forgotten records until midnight, the children's courtyard where laughter once echoed during spring festivals, and the quiet stone fountain where palace servants often gathered after exhausting days. Every familiar place remained exactly as it had always been, yet without her they already felt strangely empty. Along the edges of the courtyard, several servants struggled to hide the tears filling their eyes. They remembered the young Omega who had carried warm meals to tired guards during snowstorms, repaired worn blankets without asking for recognition, and remembered every birthday that everyone else had forgotten. To them, Claire had never been a threat. She had been the quiet heart of the palace. Ethan noticed those tears too. Questions he had buried beneath duty slowly returned to the surface of his thoughts. Why had every accusation appeared so perfectly arranged? Why had Claire never defended herself with anger? Why had the people who knew her best looked more heartbroken than relieved? Before he could answer even one of those questions, Claire reached the towering iron gates separating the royal grounds from the endless world beyond. Morning sunlight spilled across the open road ahead, painting the distant hills with soft shades of gold while the kingdom behind her remained wrapped in long shadows. She stopped for the first time since leaving the palace doors, and every person watching instinctively held their breath, believing she would finally look back. 3 years earlier, long before whispers replaced trust and silence settled between two hearts that once understood each other without words, Claire Bennett arrived at Silvermoon Palace carrying little more than a weathered suitcase and a folded recommendation letter from a small northern village. She had never dreamed of living among royalty. Her only purpose was to deliver the final charitable records entrusted to her by the elderly woman who had raised her after she lost her parents as a child. The palace was larger than anything she had ever imagined, its silver towers reaching high above the surrounding forests. But the grandeur never impressed her as much as the people who quietly worked behind those magnificent walls. On her very first morning, while nobles hurried toward an important council meeting, Claire noticed an elderly gardener struggling to lift heavy watering buckets across the palace grounds. Without introducing herself or asking permission, she set down her own belongings, rolled up the sleeves of her simple dress, and spent nearly 2 hours helping him restore flower beds damaged by an unexpected frost. By the time the last rows had been carefully replanted, Both of them were covered with dirt and smiling like old friends. Standing several stories above in the palace library, Ethan Blackwood happened to witness the entire scene through an open window. When he casually asked the head steward who the young woman was, the answer came with little interest. "She is only a visitor, Your Majesty. She should be leaving tomorrow." Yet tomorrow came and passed without Claire returning home. The palace archivist unexpectedly fell ill, leaving thousands of historical records unfinished before the approaching Winter Council. Claire quietly volunteered to organize the neglected documents until a replacement could be found. No one expected much from her, but within days the chaotic archives became perfectly arranged. Lost records were recovered. Forgotten agreements were properly cataloged. Even senior advisors admitted they had found documents and minutes that previously required hours to locate. Outside the archives, she became known for something far more important than efficiency. She remembered the names of kitchen workers others ignored. She carried warm bread to guards standing watch during freezing nights. She read stories to children visiting the palace while their parents attended public ceremonies. When servants became overwhelmed during celebrations, she stayed behind long after midnight washing dishes simply because extra hands were needed. She never spoke about kindness as though it were a virtue. To Claire, it was simply the natural way to live. Ethan found himself noticing her more often with every passing week. Unlike the nobles surrounding him, she never treated him differently because he wore a crown. She answered his questions honestly, disagreed respectfully whenever she believed another solution would better serve the people, and never sought praise after helping anyone. During one particularly difficult harvest season, she quietly presented him with a hand-drawn map identifying struggling farming communities that needed immediate support before winter arrived. Ethan studied her careful notes for nearly an hour before changing the kingdom's distribution plan, saving dozens of small villages from unnecessary hardship. He never publicly admitted where the idea had come from, yet privately, he began asking for Claire's thoughts whenever difficult decisions weighed heavily upon him. Neither of them noticed how often those conversations slowly grew longer, or how frequently palace servants smiled whenever they saw the Alpha King and the Quiet Omega discussing ordinary matters beneath the garden trees. But not everyone welcomed the growing trust between them. Hidden behind polished manners and graceful smiles, several influential council members watched the young Omega earn respect she had never asked for, and they quietly decided that the easiest way to protect their own influence was to convince the kingdom that the palace's kindest heart had become its greatest danger. The first rumor sounded too ordinary to deserve attention. A merchant quietly claimed that a shipment of blankets meant for struggling mountain villages had been delayed because someone inside the palace had changed the delivery records. A week later, another report appeared, suggesting that confidential letters had been copied without permission. Then came whispers that a young Omega with unexpected access to the royal archives had begun asking too many questions about military supply routes. None of the stories made complete sense on their own, but together they formed a picture that was difficult to ignore. Ethan Blackwood dismissed the earliest accusations without hesitation. Claire had earned his trust through countless ordinary acts of honesty, and he refused to believe careless gossip could erase years of proven character. Yet the members of the Royal Council understood something he did not. Trust rarely collapses because of one enormous lie. It weakens beneath the steady weight of many believable doubts. Lord Victor Ashcroft never directly accused Claire in front of the king. Instead, he carefully planted questions during council meetings. What if someone had gained influence simply by appearing harmless? What if kindness had become the perfect disguise? What if the kingdom was overlooking danger because everyone wanted to believe the best about a familiar face? Ethan answered those questions with patience at first, reminding the council that judgment required evidence rather than suspicion. But evidence soon began appearing with unsettling precision. Official records arrived carrying signatures that seemed authentic. Witnesses confidently described seeing Claire speaking with unfamiliar travelers near the eastern gate after sunset. Financial ledgers contained small alterations that investigators insisted had passed through the archive office under her supervision. Every discovery seemed minor, yet together they slowly formed a pattern that demanded explanation. Claire noticed the distance growing between them long before anyone spoke about it openly. The conversations that once stretched late into the evening became brief and formal. Ethan no longer stopped by the archives simply to ask how her day had gone. During council discussions, he listened politely to her suggestions, but increasingly chose the advice offered by senior nobles instead. He was never cruel. His voice remained respectful. That quiet politeness hurt far more than anger ever could because it revealed uncertainty where complete trust had once existed. One rainy afternoon, Claire entered the royal library carrying reports about food shortages affecting several farming communities nearly 100 miles north of the capital. She found Ethan standing beside the tall windows overlooking the gardens where they had once spent hours discussing ways to strengthen the kingdom before winter. She placed the reports gently upon his desk and began explaining which villages required immediate assistance. He listened carefully, but when she finished, his attention drifted toward a sealed envelope resting beside the documents. The royal seal stamped across the wax appeared genuine. Inside lay a detailed sketch of palace supply routes accompanied by handwritten notes describing storage locations that only trusted officials should have known. Ethan looked from the papers to Claire with visible conflict in his eyes. "Have you ever shared information like this with anyone outside the palace?" he asked quietly. Claire studied the unfamiliar pages before slowly shaking her head. "Never. I have never seen these documents before today." Ethan wanted to believe that answer without hesitation. Every memory they had built together urged him to trust her. Yet the growing pile of carefully arranged evidence seemed to demand caution instead. As rain continued falling beyond the library windows, neither of them realized that someone hidden within the palace had already succeeded in creating the only thing powerful enough to separate two people who had once believed completely in one another, and that was not hatred but doubt. The royal council chamber had never felt so distant from the warmth Claire Bennett once associated with home. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows, scattering ribbons of silver and blue across the polished marble floor. Yet the beauty of the room only deepened the silence that surrounded her. Every council seat was occupied. Noble families watched from the upper gallery with carefully controlled expressions. Royal guards stood motionless beside the carved stone pillars, while palace servants quietly gathered near the entrance, unable to hide the sadness reflected in their eyes. Claire walked to the center of the chamber with calm, steady steps, her hands resting loosely in front of her. She did not search for friendly faces because she already knew what fear had done to them. At the far end of the hall, Ethan Blackwood rose from the royal throne. The weight of the crown had never seemed heavier upon him. For several long moments he simply looked at Claire, remembering the countless evenings they had spent discussing harvest reports, orphaned children, and the quiet responsibilities that never appeared in official records. Those memories felt painfully close, yet impossibly far away. Lord Victor Ashcroft finally stepped forward carrying a thick collection of documents bound with dark ribbon. One by one he presented reports, witness statements, altered ledgers, and letters that appeared to prove Claire had secretly shared sensitive information with unknown travelers. Every page seemed carefully prepared. Every signature appeared authentic. Every accusation sounded convincing enough that even those who wished to defend her struggled to find the words. When the final document rested upon the council table, Ethan slowly turned toward Claire. His voice remained controlled, but the hesitation hidden beneath each word was impossible to ignore. "Claire Bennett, if there is anything these documents fail to explain, I ask you to speak now." The chamber became perfectly still. Claire looked around the room that had once welcomed her with smiles. She recognized nearly every face before her. The elderly steward whose wife she had comforted during illness. The kitchen workers who used to laugh with her while preparing meals before sunrise. The young guards whose families she had quietly helped during difficult winters. None of them doubted the kindness they had personally witnessed, yet none of them could stand against the growing fear surrounding the throne. Claire lowered her eyes toward the mountain of papers before lifting them once again to meet Ethan's gaze. "I cannot explain lies created by someone I have never seen," she answered softly. "I cannot confess to choices I never made. All I can offer is the same truth I have always lived by. Whether that truth is enough is no longer mine to decide." Her words carried no anger, no desperation, and no attempt to persuade. They carried only quiet honesty. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Everything inside him urged him to trust the woman standing before him. Yet every lesson he had learned as king reminded him that a ruler could not ignore evidence placed before the entire kingdom. Duty and trust pulled against each other until neither felt complete. At last, he opened his eyes and spoke the decision that would change both of their lives forever. Claire Bennett, until every accusation has been fully resolved beyond all doubt, you are ordered to leave Silvermoon Palace before tomorrow's sunrise. You will leave freely and unharmed, but you may no longer remain within these walls. Not a single voice challenged the decree. Claire bowed her head with quiet dignity, not because she accepted the accusations, but because she understood that the man before her was no longer choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between fear and faith, and for the first time since they had met beneath the palace gardens 3 years earlier, fear had spoken louder. Claire left the council chamber with the same quiet grace she had carried into it, refusing to let sorrow become a performance for those who had already decided what they wished to believe. The long hallways of Silvermoon Palace stretched before her beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected the pale morning light across polished stone floors. Every corner held a memory she never expected to become a farewell. She passed the royal library where Ethan had once laughed softly after discovering she had organized decades of forgotten records in only a few weeks. She walked through the garden courtyard where the first roses always bloomed after winter, because she insisted every frozen branch deserved another chance. She paused beside the children's reading room, hearing only silence where joyful voices had once filled the air. Then she continued forward without looking back. Inside her small room, nothing appeared different, yet everything had already changed. A neatly folded blanket rested at the foot of her bed. Several well-worn books remained stacked beside the window where afternoon sunlight usually warmed the wooden floor. A tiny clay flower pot still held the white flower given to her months earlier by one of the kitchen girls after the spring festival. Claire smiled gently at the blossom before carefully placing the flower pot inside her worn leather satchel. She folded each piece of clothing with patient hands, added the few books she treasured most, and quietly closed the bag. 3 years of memories required almost no space at all. When she opened the door for the final time, she found several servants waiting in the hallway. None of them had been ordered to gather there. They had simply come because they could not allow her to leave without saying goodbye. The elderly gardener stepped forward first, placing a small cloth pouch filled with rose seeds into her hand. "Wherever life takes you, Miss Claire," he said with a trembling smile. "I hope these remind you that even after the coldest winter, something beautiful still finds a way to bloom." Claire thanked him warmly before embracing the elderly man as though he were family. One by one, the kitchen workers, librarians, stable hands, and young guards quietly wished her peace. Some could not hide their tears. Others simply lowered their heads because words no longer felt large enough. Claire thanked every one of them by name, proving once again that she had remembered the people everyone else often overlooked. Outside, the enormous palace gates stood open beneath a sky washed with soft shades of gold as the first full light of morning spread across the kingdom. Ethan remained on the highest balcony overlooking the courtyard exactly where he had stood since before sunrise. He had convinced himself he was there only because a king should witness the completion of his own decree. Yet as Claire crossed the marble courtyard carrying everything she owned on one shoulder, that explanation became harder to believe. Every step she took seemed to pull something unseen away from him. The council members gathered nearby exchanged quiet words of satisfaction, convinced they had protected the kingdom from hidden danger. Ethan heard none of them. His eyes never left Claire. She reached the towering iron gates marking the edge of royal land and stopped for the first time. The morning breeze lifted the edge of her ivory cloak as sunlight stretched across the road ahead. Every person watching instinctively expected her to turn around one last time. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken with a hope he had not allowed himself to acknowledge. If she looked back, perhaps there was still something left unsaid. Claire remained facing the open road. She drew one calm breath, never turning toward the palace behind her, and in a voice so gentle that it carried through the silent morning more clearly than any royal command ever had, she spoke only 3 words. "I forgive you." The 3 words drifted through the morning air with a quietness that somehow reached every corner of the palace more powerfully than the loudest royal decree. "I forgive you." Claire did not wait for an answer because forgiveness freely given never asks to be repaid. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather satchel, stepped beyond the towering iron gates, and continued down the long country road until the gentle morning mist slowly embraced her fading silhouette. No one moved. The guards remained standing at attention, unable to lower their eyes from the empty road stretching toward the northern hills. Palace servants silently wiped away tears they no longer tried to hide. Even the council members who had demanded her exile found themselves strangely unsettled by the kindness they had just witnessed. High above the courtyard, Ethan Blackwood stood frozen upon the stone balcony as those three simple words echoed endlessly inside his mind. They should have brought him peace, yet they left behind a weight that settled deeper with every passing heartbeat. If Claire had blamed him, he could have accepted her anger. If she had argued, he could have defended his decision. Instead, she had offered compassion where resentment would have been easier, and that quiet mercy became impossible to escape. Before anyone spoke, hurried footsteps echoed through the eastern corridor leading toward the council chamber. Captain Daniel Harper entered carrying a weathered leather case sealed with the crest of the Royal Archives. His breathing was steady but urgent after riding through the night from a checkpoint nearly 80 miles east of the capital. Your Majesty, we have recovered new evidence that could not wait until tomorrow. Ethan immediately descended from the balcony and entered the council chamber, where the remaining advisors still discussed the morning's events. Daniel carefully opened the case and placed several recovered documents across the council table. A border patrol had detained a traveling courier attempting to destroy forged correspondence before crossing into a neighboring territory. Among the recovered papers were unfinished copies of palace records, duplicate royal seals, and detailed instructions describing how official ledgers had been altered before reaching the council. The royal archivist was summoned without delay. After carefully examining every page, he quietly confirmed that multiple records presented during Claire's investigation had been replaced after leaving the archive vault. Original signatures had been copied. Dates had been changed. Entire witness statements had been rewritten before receiving counterfeit seals. The palace handwriting specialist compared anonymous letters with documents recovered from the courier and reached the same conclusion. None of the accusations could be connected to Claire. Every carefully constructed piece of evidence had been manufactured by someone determined to destroy the trust she had earned. The council chamber fell completely silent. Lord Victor Ashcroft stared at the scattered documents with visible disbelief as investigators requested permission to continue tracing everyone connected to the falsified records. Ethan remained standing beside the table, unable to remove his eyes from the evidence proving that the woman he had exiled had spoken nothing but the truth. Memory after memory returned with painful clarity. Claire helping the elderly gardener beneath the spring sun. Claire carrying warm bread through winter storms. Claire quietly reminding him that every decision made by a king eventually reached ordinary families who would never stand inside the palace. Then her final words returned once more, softer than before, yet heavier than the crown resting upon his head. I forgive you. Ethan slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair, finally understanding that the greatest failure of his reign had not been allowing lies to enter his kingdom. It had been allowing doubt to silence the unwavering faith he once placed in the one person who had never asked him for power, only the chance to keep serving others with the kindness that had changed countless lives. By the following sunrise, every search party in the kingdom had received the same unexpected order from Ethan Blackwood. They were to find Claire Bennett, but no one was to pressure her, frighten her, or demand that she return. If she wished to walk away forever, her choice would be honored. He did not deserve another opportunity. He only hoped for the chance to apologize. Riders traveled across forests, mountain towns, quiet farming villages, and busy trading roads carrying carefully painted sketches of the young Omega. Weeks passed without success. Claire had never sought attention while living inside the palace, and now that she had disappeared into the wider kingdom, she seemed to leave behind only kindness instead of footprints. Wherever Ethan's messengers arrived, they heard nearly the same story told in different voices. A young woman had spent several days helping repair a damaged school roof after a spring storm before leaving without accepting payment. Someone matching her description had stayed overnight at a church shelter, preparing meals for elderly travelers before quietly continuing north the next morning. A small farming family remembered an Omega who had organized neighbors to harvest an entire field after the father injured his shoulder. She refused every reward they offered and disappeared before sunrise. Ethan listened to every account personally. Each story sounded exactly like Claire because every act reflected the woman he had failed to defend. The search lasted through changing seasons. Spring flowers gave way to warm summer fields, and summer slowly faded beneath the golden colors of autumn. During that time, Ethan found himself changing in ways no royal advisor could have predicted. Council meetings became shorter because he insisted on listening first instead of speaking first. Tax policies were rewritten after he personally visited struggling communities Claire had once urged him to help. He created a public council where ordinary citizens could present concerns directly without fear of status or title. Every decision reminded him of conversations he once shared beneath the palace gardens with the woman whose wisdom he had trusted until doubt persuaded him otherwise. Yet every improvement carried the quiet ache of knowing she was no longer there to witness any of it. Inside Silvermoon Palace, her absence lingered in places no servant dared disturb. The elderly gardener continued caring for the flower bed Claire had restored on her first morning, refusing to replace the small wooden watering can she had used because he believed she might one day return to ask about the roses. The palace library remained perfectly organized, exactly as she had left it. Even the children's reading room stayed untouched every Friday afternoon because that had always been the hour Claire spent reading stories aloud to visiting families. Ethan visited those quiet rooms more often than anyone realized. He would pause beside the empty chair near the library window or stand silently inside the greenhouse where the tiny clay flower pot she had left behind still rested beneath warm afternoon sunlight. The white blossom had continued growing despite her absence, blooming again with remarkable resilience after every passing season. Ethan often found himself staring at that single flower longer than he intended because it reminded him of the woman who had quietly transformed every life she touched without ever asking for recognition. Nearly a year after Claire walked beyond the palace gates, Ethan finally understood that searching for her was no longer only about bringing someone home. It had become a daily reminder that trust, once surrendered to fear, could not be restored simply because the truth had finally arrived. Some journeys required patience greater than regret, and if destiny ever allowed their paths to cross again, he knew he would have to earn even a single moment of her time. Winter quietly gave way to spring once again, and although Ethan Blackwood never stopped searching, he no longer expected destiny to answer on his schedule. Instead of sending larger patrols across the kingdom, he began traveling with only Captain Daniel Harper, choosing to visit the villages Claire had once helped rather than the places where people merely claimed to have seen her. Everywhere he went, her kindness had survived longer than her footsteps. Children proudly pointed toward gardens she had planted. Elderly couples spoke about the warm meals she had prepared without revealing her name. Farmers smiled while describing a gentle Omega who insisted that every person deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of wealth or title. Ethan realized that while he had spent months searching for Claire herself, the kingdom had quietly been living among the countless pieces of her generous heart she had left behind. One cool afternoon they arrived at a peaceful valley nearly 150 miles north of Silvermoon Palace. An elderly widow recognized Claire's portrait immediately. "She stayed here through the winter," the woman said with a warm smile. "She rented the little cottage beyond the maple trees. She left several weeks ago to help another community after the river flooded, but she asked me to care for the flowers until she returned." Ethan thanked the woman before walking slowly toward the small wooden cottage standing beneath a wide oak tree. The place was simple, surrounded by fresh wildflowers and neat vegetable beds that reflected the same quiet care Claire had shown everywhere she lived. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything remained orderly. A handmade quilt rested across the small bed. Several familiar books sat neatly arranged upon a shelf beside the window. Fresh herbs hung drying near the fireplace, filling the room with a comforting scent that somehow reminded Ethan of home more than the palace ever had. Nothing inside suggested bitterness or resentment. Instead, Every detail reflected a peaceful life, carefully built one ordinary day at a time. As Ethan prepared to leave, something resting beneath the books caught his attention. It was a folded envelope with no seal, addressed in Claire's careful handwriting. The words simply read, "For the day you finally understand." His hands trembled slightly before opening the letter. Inside was only a single page. "I once believed that trust meant never making mistakes. I was wrong. Trust is choosing to seek the truth even when fear offers an easier answer. If you are reading this, then perhaps you have already discovered what I hoped you eventually would. I never hated you, Ethan. I was saddened because I knew the kind man beneath the crown had allowed fear to speak louder than his own heart. If that man finds his way back, then my leaving was not meaningless. Please do not spend your life searching for someone who has already forgiven you. Spend it becoming the king your people deserve." Ethan lowered the letter slowly as silence settled around the little cottage. No accusation had been written across the page. No demand for justice. No reminder of the pain she had endured. Once again, Claire had chosen compassion over resentment. Looking through the open window toward the blooming garden outside, Ethan finally understood that forgiveness was never permission to forget the past. It was an invitation to become someone worthy of a better future, and for the first time since watching Claire disappear beyond the palace gates, hope quietly returned to a heart that had carried regret for far too long. Several weeks later, while returning from another visit to the Northern Valley, Ethan Blackwood noticed an unusual gathering beside a quiet riverside community nearly 160 miles from Silvermoon Palace. Children laughed beneath tall maple trees, while volunteers carried baskets of fresh bread toward families rebuilding homes after seasonal flooding. There was no ceremony, no royal banners, and no expectation of recognition. People simply worked together because someone had reminded them that neighbors were strongest when they lifted one another. As Ethan stepped from his horse, his eyes settled upon a familiar figure standing near the riverbank. Claire Bennett knelt beside a little girl, carefully tying the ribbon around the child's straw hat before sending her back toward her smiling parents. Time had changed many things, but not the quiet warmth that seemed to follow Claire wherever she went. For a long moment, Ethan remained exactly where he was. He had imagined this meeting countless times, during lonely nights inside the palace. Yet every carefully rehearsed speech disappeared the instant he saw her again. Claire slowly turned after hearing footsteps on the wooden bridge. Their eyes met across the soft afternoon sunlight. Neither hurried forward. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them carried memories too deep for hurried words. Ethan finally walked the remaining distance until only a few feet separated them. He removed the royal cloak from his shoulders and folded it over one arm, choosing to stand before her not as a distant king, but simply as the man who had once failed someone he deeply respected. "I found your letter," he said quietly. Claire nodded with a gentle smile. "I hoped you would someday." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before meeting hers again. "I believed I understood justice, but I confused caution with wisdom. I believed I was protecting my kingdom, yet I failed to protect the person who had protected its people every single day. I cannot erase what happened. I cannot ask you to forget it. I only wanted the chance to tell you that I was wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I learned from that mistake." Claire listened without interruption. There was no triumph in her expression because forgiveness had never been about winning. She looked toward the families rebuilding their homes before speaking in the same calm voice Ethan had carried within his heart ever since the morning she left the palace. "A crown does not make someone worthy of trust," she said softly. "Neither does one mistake make someone beyond redemption. What matters is the direction a person chooses after discovering the truth." She looked back at Ethan, her eyes filled not with the innocence of the woman who had first arrived at Silvermoon Palace, but with the quiet strength of someone who had endured disappointment without allowing it to harden her heart. "I never needed a perfect king, Ethan. I only hoped you would become a wiser man." A peaceful silence settled between them before Ethan smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. It was not the smile of a ruler celebrating victory. It was the quiet relief of someone who had finally stopped running from his greatest regret. Claire did not promise to return to the palace that afternoon, and Ethan did not ask her to. Instead, they spent the remaining hours helping villagers carry supplies, repair fences, and plant young trees along the riverbank. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the distant hills, the road ahead remained unwritten. But this time it was no longer built upon fear or misunderstanding. It rested upon humility, forgiveness, and the simple truth that real strength is measured not by the power to command others, but by the courage to admit when your heart was wrong and the wisdom to become someone worthy of the trust you once lost. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.